The wind carried the scent of smoke, gunpowder, and blood. It whistled through the high walls of the canyon, echoing the cries that had faded hours before. The battle between the Comanche warriors and the U.S. cavalry had ended in ruin. Bodies sprawled across the rock-strewn ground. Arrows snapped, rifles discarded, and the faint buzz of flies already beginning their mournful feast. In that desolate silence, one life clung stubbornly to the edge of survival. His name was Tahu, war leader of the Numunu, the Comanche. Once, his presence alone could steady a frightened band or summon courage in men twice his size. He was known among friend and enemy alike for his intelligence, his refusal to torture captives, his belief that a leader must be the first to bleed and the last to eat. Yet now he lay broken against the red earth, blood seeping from a gunshot wound high in his shoulder and another through his thigh. His war horse had fallen beside him, its dark eyes glassy with death. His people had been scattered, forced to retreat when the soldiers' rifles cut through their charge like thunder from the gods. Tahu's breath rattled shallowly in his chest. The sun blazed overhead, merciless, baking the stone beneath him. Each inhale was a battle, each heartbeat a stubborn act of defiance. He thought of his brother, Red Elk, of his small son waiting by the river camp, and of the words he had spoken before the fight. "If I fall, let the wind remember me." He didn't know the wind would do more than remember. It would carry his faint whispers up to a pair of human ears that were never meant to hear them. Far above, on the rim of the canyon, the settlement of McGraw's Crossing shimmered in the heat. Its rough cabins and barbed fences clung to the landscape like defiant scars. There, a 10-year-old girl named Annie McGraw sat alone on the porch, watching the horizon tremble under the weight of the sun. She was small, freckled, and too serious for her age. The kind of child who asked questions grown-ups didn't like answering. Her mother had died 2 years earlier of fever, leaving only her and her father, Jed, to keep the homestead alive. Jed was a man carved out of dust and hard days. He didn't speak much and never smiled. When he did talk, it was often about Indians, always with bitterness. To him, they were thieves and killers, nothing more. Annie had learned early not to argue, but she carried a secret softness in her heart, the kind her mother had called a gift from God. She fed stray dogs, rescued birds from traps, and once nursed a wounded fox kit back to health, hiding it in her room until it could limp away on its own. That evening, as she sat watching the fading light turn the canyon gold, Annie heard it, a sound so faint it could have been a trick of wind. A broken human sound, a moan. She froze, heart thudding. When she asked her father if he heard it, he just grunted and said, "Coyotes fighting over carcasses. Get inside." But Annie couldn't shake the feeling. As darkness settled, she stepped outside again, barefoot, the air cooling around her. The moon climbed over the canyon rim, silver and silent. The sound came again, weak, distant, like someone calling for help from the belly of the earth. She stood at the edge of the drop-off, clutching her lantern, peering into the depths. Down below, the canyon floor gleamed faintly, littered with shadows. She didn't know it yet, but somewhere among them lay a dying warrior, and the decision she made that night, to listen, to care, to climb, would change 2 lives and bridge a chasm carved wider than the canyon itself. Morning broke bright and cloudless over McGraw's Crossing, but the beauty of it did little to soften the roughness of the place. The land was raw and wide, nothing between a soul and the sky but heat, dust, and the occasional cry of a hawk. Annie McGraw rose early, as she always did, to fetch water from the well before her father woke. She moved quietly so as not to disturb him. Jed McGraw disliked being reminded of how much he depended on his daughter's small hands to keep the homestead running. Annie's world was made of chores and silence. Since her mother's death, the house had become a place of work, not warmth. Jed spoke little, ate quickly, and poured all his energy into the land. He carried his grief like a stone in his boot, heavy, constant, unspoken. He warned Annie about Indians, storms, and foolish fancies, saying the frontier punished softness. Yet Annie's heart refused to harden. Somewhere deep inside, she still believed kindness had power, even here. That afternoon, she helped mend a fence and hauled water for the horses. When the chores were done, she sat beneath the shade of the cottonwood that grew by the canyon's lip. The canyon stretched vast and secret before her, a scar across the earth that swallowed light and sound alike. Annie liked it there because it made her feel small in a good way, like part of something grand and old. Sometimes she would close her eyes and listen to the wind rush through the chasm below. It had a voice, she was sure of it, low, whispering, full of stories no one else could hear. That day, the wind's voice was different. It wasn't playful or wild. It trembled as though burdened by sorrow. She heard it first as a sigh, then, so faint she nearly doubted her own ears, a moan. Not the bark of a coyote or the cry of a hawk, but something human. The sound prickled the back of her neck. She leaned forward, gripping a rock for balance, and called out, "Hello?" The canyon swallowed her voice whole, offering only silence in return. When her father came looking for her at dusk, she mentioned the sound. Jed frowned, spitting tobacco into the dust. "Just the wind playing tricks," he said. "You stay away from that edge, Annie. Ain't nothing down there but bones." His tone left no room for argument. He turned back toward the cabin, leaving her standing in the orange glow of sunset, the wind curling around her bare ankles. But Annie couldn't forget it. As darkness gathered, the feeling grew stronger. A tug in her chest, a whisper that wasn't quite a word, but somehow meant come back. She tried to read her Bible by lantern light, but the letters swam before her eyes. The sound returned, softer now, like breathing. She set the book aside and pressed her ear to the window. Still there, still calling. Her heart pounded as she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. She hesitated at the door, glancing toward the shape of her father slumped in sleep by the hearth, then slipped outside. The night air was cool and clean after the heat of the day. She carried her small lantern and started toward the canyon, her feet whispering through the dry grass. The world below the ridge was all shadow. She knelt at the rim, holding the lantern out over the edge. Far beneath, something flickered, barely a glint, perhaps of metal or eyes reflecting light. She blinked, thinking she imagined it. Then came the sound again, a groan, faint but unmistakably alive. A chill ran through her. Fear warred with curiosity, but compassion won. "Hello?" she whispered again, her voice trembling. No answer came, yet the pull remained. She could not explain it, only feel that something down there needed her. She turned her gaze toward the narrow trail that wound into the canyon. It looked steep and dangerous, and her father's warning echoed in her mind. But another voice, softer and stronger, whispered through the wind, "If you don't go, no one will." Annie took a deep breath, tightened her grip on the lantern, and began her descent into the dark. The trail into the canyon looked far steeper in moonlight than Annie had imagined from above. Shadows clung to the walls like ghosts, and the air smelled of dust, sage, and something metallic. Blood, though she didn't yet know it. Her little lantern threw a trembling circle of light that wavered with each step. Rocks shifted beneath her bare feet. Every sound, the scrape of her dress, the tumble of gravel, the soft thud of her heartbeat, echoed 100 times over until it seemed the canyon itself was alive and listening. She paused halfway down, pressing her back against the stone to steady herself. The drop below was dizzying, the ground a maze of darkness and pale boulders. For a moment she thought of turning back. Her father's voice rang in her head. "You stay away from that edge." "Annie, ain't nothing down there but bones." But another voice, faint and pleading, rose from the canyon floor. One short, ragged breath followed by a sound that might have been a word. Her fear melted into resolve. She tightened her grip on a jutting root and kept going. The descent tore at her hands and knees. She slipped once, skinning her palm on a sharp rock. The pain made her eyes sting, but she bit her lip and carried on inch by inch. The closer she came to the bottom, the heavier the air felt, thick with heat and silence. The moon disappeared behind the rim, plunging the canyon into near darkness. Only her lantern, its weak yellow heart, guided her now. When her feet finally touched solid ground, the world seemed to exhale around her. The canyon floor was strewn with the remnants of battle, broken arrows, a crushed hat, the splintered shaft of a rifle. Horses lay motionless in the dirt. Annie clutched her shawl tighter and stepped carefully among them, her small light brushing over still faces and empty eyes. Her stomach twisted, but she forced herself onward, listening for that faint voice she had followed down. Then she saw it, a shape half hidden behind a fallen horse, large and unmoving. Her breath caught. She lifted the lantern higher. The light fell upon the painted face of a man, his skin coppered by sun and streaked with dust and blood, feathers tangled in his hair. A necklace of claws hung against his bare chest, sticky with dried blood. For a long moment, Annie could only stare. He was everything her father had warned her about, an Indian warrior, fierce and fearsome even in ruin. But then she saw the wound, a dark, glistening hole in his shoulder, another in his thigh. His chest rose barely enough to prove he lived, and his face, though hardened by pain, looked not angry, only lost. Something inside her shifted. He was no monster. He was a man dying alone. She knelt beside him, setting the lantern down. "Sir?" she whispered. "Can you hear me?" No response, only a faint tremor of breath. She reached for her bonnet, scooped it full of cool water from a trickle that ran between the rocks, and poured a few drops over his lips. He swallowed weakly. Encouraged, she did it again. His eyelids fluttered open, and for an instant their eyes met, his dark and clouded, hers wide with wonder and fear. He tried to speak, but only a rasp came out. Annie shook her head. "Don't try. You're hurt bad." She tore a strip from the hem of her dress and pressed it against the bleeding wound, hands trembling. Her mother had once shown her how to stop bleeding on a calf that cut itself on barbed wire. She did the same now, remembering every motion. The warrior groaned, but did not push her away. When the bandage held, Annie sat back, breathing hard. The canyon seemed quieter than before, as though the earth itself were watching them. She looked up at the sliver of sky far above, so distant, so cold, and then back at the stranger beside her. "I found you," she whispered, not sure if he understood. "You're not alone now." He closed his eyes, a faint sigh escaping him. Annie pulled her shawl over his chest, shielding him from the night air, then curled up beside the dying fire of her lantern. Sleep came slowly, heavy with exhaustion, and the thrill of fear conquered. When dawn finally spilled down the canyon walls, it found them there. A small girl and a wounded warrior, two worlds that had never meant to meet, bound now by the fragile breath of mercy. The first rays of morning crawled down the canyon walls, turning the red stone gold. Annie stirred, stiff and chilled, her dress torn and dusty. For a moment she didn't remember where she was. Then she heard it, the faint, uneven breathing beside her, and everything came rushing back. The warrior still lived. He lay where she had left him, half covered by her shawl. His skin was gray with fever and dust, and his wounds had soaked through the strips of her torn dress. The smell of blood hung thick in the cool air. Annie's heart twisted. She hadn't really believed he would still be alive come sunrise, yet somehow he was. "Hey," she whispered softly, kneeling beside him. "Can you hear me?" His eyelids fluttered open, dark eyes dazed but aware. For a few seconds he only stared at her, as if unsure she was real. His lips moved, forming a sound that wasn't quite a word. Annie didn't understand, but she saw gratitude flicker across his face. "Don't talk," she said, her voice trembling between fear and determination. "You just rest." She looked around. The canyon floor stretched empty and silent, the remnants of battle scattered like forgotten bones. Somewhere high above, a hawk circled. She knew she should go home. Her father would be furious, but when she looked back at the man's wounds, the thought of leaving him there to die felt wrong. Her mother's voice seemed to whisper in her memory. "When someone needs help, Annie, you help. No matter who they are," the words gave her courage. She untied the small cloth bundle at her waist. Her breakfast from yesterday, half a biscuit and a bit of jerky. She broke the biscuit into pieces and moistened it with a few drops of water before pressing it gently to the man's lips. He hesitated, then took it, swallowing with effort. She smiled, relieved. "I'll get you more," she promised. "There's water close by." Carrying her bonnet again, she hurried to the shallow stream that ran through the canyon floor. The water was clear and cold, whispering over stones. Annie rinsed her hands and filled the bonnet. As she returned, she caught sight of her reflection in the ripples. Smudged face, wild hair, eyes far older than her 10 years. A little girl, yes, but one standing in a world that demanded courage beyond her size. Back beside the warrior, she used the water to clean his wounds as best she could. He winced but didn't resist. Annie tore more cloth from her dress, binding his thigh tightly. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, exhausted but proud. The man's gaze followed her movements. Slowly, painfully, he raised a trembling hand and touched his chest, then pointed at her. "Tahu," he rasped, his voice low and rough as gravel. Annie blinked. "Ta, you?" she repeated, uncertain. He nodded faintly. "Tahu." Then, after a pause, he pointed again, this time at her. "Annie," she said, her voice soft. His lips moved to echo it. "Ah, nay." For the first time since her mother's death, Annie felt something like warmth fill her chest. Here, in this silent canyon, two people from worlds that hated each other shared names like offerings. Hours passed. She stayed beside him, fetching water, adjusting his bandages, humming softly to keep herself brave. She sang an old lullaby her mother used to hum by the fire. Though Tahu couldn't understand the words, his eyes softened and his breathing steadied. The canyon seemed to grow still, listening. When afternoon light spilled across the rocks, Annie realized how long she'd been gone. Her father would be searching soon. She stood reluctantly. "I have to go," she told him. "But I'll come back. You'll see." Tahu's hand twitched, as if to reach for her, then fell weakly against the earth. She took it for a promise that he'd hold on until she returned. Clutching her lantern, Annie began the long climb back up, her legs shaking, her heart pounding with something fierce and new. Purpose. Behind her, the wounded warrior closed his eyes, whispering her name like a prayer to the wind. And the wind carried it softly up the canyon walls, Ani, as if the earth itself had taken note of the life she had given back. The sun had already risen high when Annie reached the top of the canyon and slipped back into the dry grasslands that surrounded her home. Her dress was torn, her knees scraped raw, and her hands were blistered from climbing. The McGraw homestead sat quiet in the distance, smoke curling from the chimney. Her father was likely still out tending to the stock, and that gave her time. Time to do what her heart demanded. She hurried to the shed behind the house, filling a small sack with food, a chunk of cornbread, 2 apples, a strip of dried beef. From the cupboard, she took a clean rag and one of her mother's old bandages, still folded neatly in a tin box. Annie hesitated only a moment before whispering, "Sorry, Mama," and tucking it into the sack. Then she was running again, barefoot over the prairie, the wind in her hair, the canyon waiting like a secret she had to protect. By the time she reached the bottom again, her lungs burned, but she hardly noticed. Tahu still lay where she had left him, though he seemed weaker, his breathing shallow. She knelt quickly and unwrapped the food. When she pressed the cornbread to his lips, his eyes flickered open. Recognition dawned in them, surprise, then relief. "I told you I'd come back," Annie said softly, setting the food before him. Tahu's lips curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. He reached for the apple with trembling fingers, but his hand faltered halfway. Annie caught it gently and placed the fruit into his palm. "Here," she said. "Eat slow." The warrior bit into it, the sound small but steady. He ate little, but every mouthful seemed to give him new strength. When he finished, he pointed at the sky, then at the canyon walls, murmuring words she couldn't understand. His voice was low and melodic, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. Annie listened, fascinated. "You talk pretty," she whispered. "I don't know what you're saying, but it sounds like singing." Tahu looked at her, puzzled but curious. He pointed at himself again. "Tahu," he said clearly. She nodded, pleased. "Yes, Tahu," she touched her chest. "Annie," He repeated it more surely this time. Ani. They smiled at each other. Two strangers from enemy worlds sharing the first fragile thread of understanding. As the day stretched on, Annie busied herself with tending his wounds. She cleaned the old bandage, used her mother's cloth to bind the shoulder wound tighter, and sprinkled cool water on his forehead to fight the fever rising beneath his skin. Tahu bore the pain in silence, his dark eyes never leaving her small, determined face. At one point, when she saw him wince, she reached for his hand without thinking. "It's all right," she murmured. "You're not alone." Something in her tone, gentle, certain, seemed to reach him. His fingers curled weakly around hers. For a moment they simply sat like that, the canyon around them utterly still, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Annie began to hum, almost shyly at first, then louder. It was the same lullaby her mother used to sing, soft and wistful. The sound carried through the canyon, echoing faintly off the stone. Tahu's eyes closed. He didn't understand the words, but the melody soothed him. He could feel the kindness behind it, pure, untainted by fear or hatred. When the song ended, he whispered something in his own language, a word that sounded like Taba, spoken with reverence. He touched his heart, then gestured toward her. Annie didn't know its meaning, but she felt what it meant. "Thank you," she guessed. He nodded once, slow and solemn. Hours passed before she finally stood. The sky had turned orange and gold again. "I have to go now," she said reluctantly. "Pa'll be wondering." Tahu opened his mouth as if to protest, then only nodded. Annie hesitated, then placed her small hand on his arm. "I'll come back tomorrow," she promised. "Don't you give up." When she climbed back up, the canyon began to darken. Tahu lay still, watching the place where she'd vanished, the faint echo of her song lingering in the air. For the first time since the battle, he believed he might live, not because of strength or medicine, but because of the strange, unspoken language between them, the language of kindness. The morning came sharp and bright over the prairie, but the warmth of the sun did nothing to ease Jed McGraw's anger. His daughter's bed was empty, the blanket tossed aside, her boots gone from the door. For the second time in 2 days, she had vanished without a word. He found her footprints leading toward the canyon, small prints in the dust, quick and determined. A curse burned on his lips as he mounted his horse. "Fool child," he muttered. "You'll get yourself killed." By the time Jed rode to the edge of the canyon, 2 neighbors had joined him. Tom Briggs, a heavy-set rancher, and Amos Pike, a thin, wiry man with a soldier's eyes. Both carried rifles. "She been wandering off again?" Tom asked. "Reckon so," Jed replied. His jaw tightened as he studied the vast hollow below. The canyon looked empty, but unease crawled through him. "If she went down there, she's gone mad." "Could be wolves or worse," Amos spat over the edge. "Heard tell a Comanche war party passed through here a few days back. Some say one of their chiefs got shot but didn't die." "Could be stragglers." Jed's grip on the reins tightened. "If there's an Indian down there and he's laid a hand on her—" He didn't finish. Rage clouded his thoughts. The men spread out, calling Annie's name, their voices echoing off the red stone. Down below, Annie heard the shouts long before she saw them. She had come early that morning, carrying food and a jar of milk from the cellar. Tahu had grown stronger, his fever breaking in the cool night, and when he smiled at her weakly, she felt the world brighten. But the sound of men's voices froze her mid-step. Her heart pounded. She knew those voices, her father's among them. Panic clawed up her throat. If he found Tahu, there would be no mercy, no listening, no chance to explain. Jed McGraw hated Indians the way dry land hates fire. Tahu noticed her fear. He struggled to sit up, pain tightening his features. "What?" he asked in his broken English. Annie crouched beside him, whispering urgently. "My pa, he's coming, with others." She pointed toward the canyon rim. "They'll kill you if they find you." Tahu's jaw set grimly. He understood enough. He tried to rise, but his wounded leg buckled. He fell back, gasping. Annie caught him, desperation in her small voice. "Please, just stay quiet. I'll hide you." She dragged branches and brush toward a crevice between two rocks near the stream, just wide enough for him to fit. It wasn't much of a hiding place, but it was all she had. With every passing shout, her hands moved faster. Tahu didn't argue. He could see the fire in her eyes, the same fierce will that lived in warriors twice her size. When she helped him crawl into the narrow space, he reached out suddenly and pressed something into her palm, a small carved stone shaped like a wolf. "Spirit," he whispered. "Strong," Annie nodded, tears brimming. "You be quiet, okay? I'll tell them I got lost." Moments later, her father's voice boomed from above. "Annie, you down there?" She swallowed hard, then called back, forcing her voice to sound frightened and small. "Pa, I fell down the trail!" The men appeared at the rim and spotted her. "Stay put," Jed shouted. "We're coming down." Annie glanced toward the hidden crevice where Tahu lay silent, then climbed out into the open. By the time Jed reached her, she had already rehearsed the lie. "I came to look at the river," she said breathlessly. "I slipped. I didn't mean to scare you." Jed's face was a thundercloud. "You near broke my heart, girl." He grabbed her by the arm, hauling her toward his horse. "You don't never come down here again, you hear me? This place ain't safe." Annie kept her eyes low. "Yes, sir." Behind them, hidden beneath stone and shadow, Tahu listened to the hoofbeats fade. He knew what she had done, risked her father's wrath, even her life, to save him. When the last echo vanished, he looked toward the sliver of sky and murmured her name. "Annie." Above the canyon, Annie turned once to glance back. Their worlds remained divided by fear, but in that silent moment, the two shared the same prayer, that the secret of mercy would survive another day. The air in the McGraw cabin that evening felt heavy enough to choke on. Jed McGraw paced in front of the hearth, boots scraping against the rough wooden floor. His temper had cooled from fire to iron, quiet, sharp, and dangerous. Annie sat at the table, hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on a knot in the wood. "I told you not to go near that canyon," Jed said finally, voice low but trembling with anger. "You could have fallen. You could have been bit by a rattler, or worse." "I'm sorry, Pa," Annie whispered. "I didn't mean to." He slammed his hand against the table. "Don't lie to me. You went down there for a reason." "What is it?" She flinched but didn't answer. She couldn't. If she told him the truth about the wounded Comanche warrior hiding among the rocks, he would ride straight there with his rifle before sunrise. She kept her lips pressed tight, praying he'd drop it. Jed studied her, suspicion darkening his face. Finally he sighed, weary more than angry. "You're all I got left, Annie. I can't lose you too. Do you understand?" Her throat ached. "Yes, Pa." He poured himself a measure of whiskey, drank it in one swallow, and muttered something about needing rest. When his boots finally creaked across the floor toward the bedroom, Annie sat still a long while staring into the fire. The flames crackled softly, reminding her of the canyon, the red glow of the rocks at sunset, the quiet strength in Tahu's eyes. She couldn't leave him there alone. When her father's snores began rumbling through the wall, she slipped on her shawl, took the lantern, and tiptoed out into the night. The prairie stretched silent beneath a silver moon, and the wind whispered like a warning. Annie ignored it. Her heart beat hard with guilt and fear, but her feet knew where to go. The descent into the canyon was faster this time. She'd learned the safe holds, the narrow path between stones. Her lantern light flickered over the familiar shapes until she saw him, Tahu lying awake, his dark eyes reflecting the glow. He greeted her with a faint nod. "Annie," he murmured. "I'm sorry," she said, kneeling beside him. "Pa almost found you. He was so angry." Tahu reached out weakly, touching her arm in silent reassurance. His skin burned with fever. She realized then how bad his wounds had grown. The smell of infection filled the air. Her chest tightened. She'd come too late. No, you're not gonna die," she whispered, tearing open her small bundle. She had stolen her mother's herbs from the pantry, dried yarrow and sage, and crushed them with her hands, mixing them with water from the stream. "This'll help, I think." Tahu watched her work, curiosity flickering through his pain. When she pressed the cool paste to his wound, he hissed but did not pull away. "Little brave," he said quietly, voice breaking. "You... strong." Annie smiled faintly, blinking back tears. "Mama used to say that kindness don't make you weak. It makes you right." He didn't understand every word, but he understood enough. He closed his eyes and whispered something soft in his language. A prayer, perhaps, or a thank you. Annie sat beside him, humming her mother's lullaby again. Her song mingled with the murmur of water and the sigh of the wind. For a time, the canyon felt like a church, holy and still. Then, far away, came the distant echo of horses. Annie froze. Men's voices carried faintly through the canyon. A search party, maybe soldiers. "They're coming!" she gasped. Tahu tried to rise, but his strength failed him. Annie grabbed his hand, trembling. "You have to stay hidden," she said, her voice fierce now. "You hear me?" "Don't make a sound." He nodded weakly. "Annie, go." She hesitated, tears stinging her eyes. "I'll come back. I promise." As she climbed toward the rim, the hoofbeats grew louder, closer. Fear clawed at her heart, but she kept moving. Behind her, in the shadows, Tahu lay still, gripping the small wolf carving that matched the courage of the little girl who refused to abandon him. By the time the soldiers' voices echoed through the canyon floor, Annie was already gone, her lantern a faint star vanishing into the dark. And below, a wounded man whispered to the wind a single word that meant both blood and mercy in his tongue. Taba. By dawn, the plains trembled with tension. A patrol of soldiers had ridden through the valley, dust rising behind their horses like storm clouds. They carried rifles and fear in equal measure. Word had spread through the settlements that a wounded Comanche warrior had been seen near the canyon. Inside the McGraw cabin, Annie listened from behind the curtain as her father spoke to Captain Harlan, the officer in charge. Harlan was a tall man with a sharp beard and sharper eyes that never softened. "You say your girl wandered down there yesterday?" Harlan asked. Jed nodded, his voice rough. "Found her down by the river. She swore she was alone, but she's been acting strange. Skittish." Harlan's gaze narrowed. "If there's an Indian alive out there, he won't be for long. Can't have one of them spying on the settlements." He turned to his men. "We'll sweep the canyon by sundown." Annie's stomach twisted. Her father said nothing, but the lines around his mouth deepened. After the soldiers rode off, he poured himself coffee and stared at the fire without speaking. "Pa," Annie said softly, stepping closer. "Maybe you shouldn't let them go down there." "What if they're wrong?" He looked up sharply. "Wrong! Annie, you don't understand men like that. If they say there's a savage hiding out there, there probably is." Her heart thudded painfully. "But what if he's hurt?" Jed's face hardened. "Hurt or not, that's what happens when they raid white homesteads." "Don't waste your pity," she bit her tongue, tears pricking her eyes. He would never understand. The man she'd found wasn't a monster. He'd been broken and bleeding, not fighting. He'd thanked her with eyes full of gratitude, not hate. When her father went outside to chop wood, Annie packed another small satchel, bandages, bread, and a flask of water, and slipped out the back door. The canyon looked different in the daylight, open, exposed, and dangerous. Every gust of wind seemed to whisper her name, warning her to turn back. But she kept climbing, each foothold steady, each breath a silent prayer. When she reached the hollow where Tahu lay, her heart broke. His wound was worse, the bandage soaked through with blood. He tried to sit when he saw her, but the effort drew a low groan from his chest. "Soldiers coming," he rasped, pointing weakly toward the canyon rim. She nodded, kneeling beside him. "I know, I came to get you out." He stared at her, confused. "No, you go." "They kill me. I won't leave you," she said fiercely. "You saved me once." He frowned. "Saved?" She nodded, eyes filling. "When I found you, I was scared. But you didn't hurt me. You trusted me. You saved me from being like them, from hating." Something flickered in his gaze. Pain, pride, and sorrow mingled. "You brave heart," he said slowly. The sound of horses cracked the air above them. Annie's breath caught. The soldiers were close, too close. She helped Tahu lean on her shoulder, her small frame trembling under his weight. Together they stumbled toward a deeper crevice, one she'd noticed the night before. It wound beneath a stone ledge, dark and narrow but hidden from view. As they crawled inside, the ground shook with hoofbeats. Voices echoed down, sharp commands and laughter. "Spread out! Check every corner!" Captain Harlan's voice thundered. Annie held her breath. Dust rained down from the rocks as boots scuffed above them. Tahu lay beside her, his breathing ragged. She could hear the tremor in his chest and knew that if he coughed, they'd both be found. She reached for his hand, pressing her fingers to his lips in warning. He nodded weakly. The soldiers lingered, searching, but the shadows kept their secret. Minutes felt like hours. Then, silence. The hoofbeats faded. Annie exhaled shakily, tears spilling down her cheeks. Tahu turned his head toward her, whispering, "Good spirit." She shook her head, whispering back, "Just scared." But inside she knew the truth. Fear hadn't stopped her. Mercy had guided her here again, into danger, into a moment that could cost her everything. Outside, the sun dipped low, painting the canyon walls with fire. Above them, the soldiers rode away, believing the hunt was over. Yet in the hidden hollow below, 2 fugitives, 1 child, 1 warrior, waited in the stillness, bound together by a secret that would soon test the courage of them both. Enemies were everywhere. Men, laws, even the beliefs of her own blood. But Annie felt no regret. For the first time, she understood what her mother had meant when she'd said, "Mercy can make a warrior braver than any bullet ever could." By the next evening, thunderclouds rolled in from the west, dark and low, spreading over the plains like a bruise. The smell of rain came sharp through the air, and with it, something heavier. Inevitability. Annie sat by the canyon's edge again, clutching the wolf carving Tahu had given her. Every sound, the crack of thunder, the whisper of wind, made her jump. Down below, the hidden crevice where she had left him waited in silence. He was too weak to move on his own, and the soldiers would come again, searching harder this time. She had to make a choice. When she turned toward home, she saw her father already saddling his horse. His face was grim, his jaw tight. "Harlan's men found blood near the river," he said without looking at her. "They think the Indian's still down there." "I'm going with them." Her heart stopped. "Pa, don't, please." He cut her off, voice like iron. "Don't argue. If he's still alive, he's dangerous. You don't know what them people do to settlers." Tears welled in her eyes. "You're wrong." Jed looked at her then, really looked, and saw something in her face that made him pause. "You know something I don't?" Annie's lips trembled. She wanted to lie, but her throat refused. "He's not what you think," she whispered. "He's hurt, Pa. He didn't hurt nobody." "I saw him." Jed froze. The color drained from his face. "You what?" "I found him after the soldiers shot him." He was dying. "I couldn't just leave him." For a long, terrible moment, the wind was the only sound. Then Jed's voice came low, shaking, not with weakness, but rage. "You went back to him? You've been helping him?" Annie nodded, tears spilling. "He's not our enemy. He's just a man, Pa." Jed's hands curled into fists. "That man's kind burned farms, stole horses, killed women and children. And you brought him food?" She backed away, sobbing. "He saved me too, Pa. When I was scared, he didn't hurt me." "He just needed help!" Jed's face twisted in conflict. The world he knew, one divided cleanly between right and wrong, white and red, friend and foe, was cracking. But before he could answer, thunder split the sky. Rain began to pour in sheets, drenching the dust, turning the trail to mud. The soldiers rode up just then, Captain Harlan at their head. "We're moving out!" he shouted over the storm. "The tracks lead straight through the canyon. If he's still breathing, we'll flush him out." Jed hesitated. Annie saw his hand tighten on the reins, torn between duty and love. She reached for him desperately. "Please, Pa, don't let them kill him." He stared at her for a long moment, then swung into the saddle. "Stay inside, Annie," he said hoarsely. "You've done enough." But as the men galloped toward the canyon, she knew she wouldn't obey. The storm raged as Annie scrambled down the trail once more. The rain stung her face, lightning flashing across the canyon walls. When she reached the crevice, she found Tahu half conscious, eyes fluttering open. You came, he whispered. I'm getting you out, she said fiercely. She pulled at his arm, trying to help him stand, but his strength was nearly gone. Thunder cracked again, this time followed by something sharper. Gunfire. Voices echoed through the canyon. They're here, Tahu rasped. Annie's heart pounded. She dragged him toward a narrow gully where water was rushing down in torrents. We can follow the stream. It'll hide our tracks, she said breathlessly. Tahu nodded weakly, leaning on her. They stumbled forward, slipping in the mud, their hands clutching at the slick rocks. Behind them, rifle shots cracked again. Closer now. Don't stop, she cried. Please! But then, from the ridge above, came her father's voice, shouting her name. Annie, get away from him! Lightning lit the canyon, and in that flash, Jed saw them, his daughter half carrying the wounded Comanche through the storm. He raised his rifle and froze. Through the rain, he saw the way she held Tahu, not in fear, but in fierce, desperate protection. Her small frame shaking, her eyes blazing with something he hadn't seen since her mother died. Mercy. For a moment, Jed McGraw saw not an enemy, but a man clinging to life, and a child who'd risked everything to defend him. The rifle lowered. The thunder rolled again, drowning out his voice as he whispered her name, no longer a shout of anger, but of heartbreak. The storm passed in the night, leaving behind a world washed clean. The canyon glistened in the pale light of dawn, every rock dark with rain, every sound hushed beneath the slow drip of water. Smoke rose faintly from the soldiers' camp by the ridge, the smell of gunpowder lingering where thunder and rifles had met the sky. Annie woke first. She was lying beneath a rock shelf, soaked to the bone, her head resting against Tahu's shoulder. For a heartbeat, she couldn't remember how they'd gotten there. Then it all came back. The chase, the rain, the voices shouting her name. Tahu stirred beside her. His breathing was shallow but steadier than before. The rain had washed the blood from his wounds, and the fever seemed to have broken. His eyes opened slowly, dark and quiet as the canyon itself. Storm gone, he whispered. Annie smiled weakly. It is. You made it through. He looked at her for a long time, as if searching for words bigger than his broken English could hold. Finally, he said, You, heart strong like mountain. Her cheeks flushed, but she only shook her head. You're the strong one. She stopped, hearing something above them. Hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate. Then a shadow fell across the rock. Her father stood there. Jed McGraw looked older than he had the day before. The storm had soaked his clothes and streaked his face with mud, but it was the eyes that had changed most. Tired, uncertain, hollowed out by what he'd seen. He stared down at them, his daughter clutching the wounded Comanche's hand, and for a long moment no one spoke. Annie rose slowly, trembling. Pa, she said, voice small. Please don't shoot. He didn't do nothing wrong. Jed's fingers hovered over the trigger of his rifle. You don't know what you're asking, Annie. Yes, I do, she said, stepping between them. You said Ma believed in mercy. You taught me to pray for folks who were hurtin', even if they weren't like us. That's all I did. The rifle lowered an inch. His jaw tightened, the war inside him raging silent and hard. Tahu tried to sit up, wincing. If kill me. Girl safe, he said, his voice breaking. She good. Jed's eyes flicked toward him, saw the pain, the dignity, the humanity, and something cracked. The hate he'd carried for years, built from fear and loss, began to crumble under the weight of his daughter's courage. Don't talk, Jed said roughly, lowering the rifle completely. Ain't no one dying today. Annie's breath caught. She turned to her father, hope shining through her tears. You mean it? He sighed. He's bleeding out and half-starved. What's the sense in finishing what the storm near did already? He knelt beside Tahu, inspecting the wound. His hands, once so quick to strike or work, now moved slow and careful. You'll need rest and clean bandages. I can take you to the barn till you can travel. Annie's heart swelled. For the first time, she saw her father not as a man divided by hate, but as the man her mother had loved, the one who still believed, deep down, in doing what was right. Together, they built a stretcher from fallen branches and carried Tahu up the canyon trail. The sun broke through the clouds as they climbed, spilling gold across the wet earth. When they reached the rim, the world below shimmered, washed in light. By the time they reached the cabin, the soldiers were gone. Captain Harlan had declared the search over. No body, no trail, no threat. The McGraw homestead stood quiet in the morning calm, smoke curling from the chimney like a prayer. Jed and Annie laid Tahu on a cot in the barn. The horses snorted softly, uneasy but curious. Annie fetched water, while Jed bound the wound tight with clean cloth. When it was done, Tahu looked at them both, eyes soft with gratitude. "You saved me," he murmured. Jed shook his head. "No, she did." Annie smiled faintly, brushing the hair from her face. "We both did, I think." Outside, the first true rays of sunlight broke through the thinning clouds, spreading over the prairie, warm, golden, alive. The storm had passed, but something deeper had shifted too. In the silence that followed, Jed McGraw looked at his daughter, at her small hands that had defied hatred and fear, and whispered, almost to himself, "Reckon your ma would have been proud." And from the cot, with the ghost of a smile, Tahu whispered in his tongue the only word he knew to fit the moment. "Peace."